Remember that the building is the system, and so when you're designing a building, you want to think about what direction is that building oriented and where are you putting what kinds of uses. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, when you think about orientation, you think about the sun coming from the south, and so here's a diagram that you might make to help you think about temperatures. In the winter time, the sun comes in from the south, and that south side will be warm. So that might be where you want your living spaces. The north side is going to be very cold because the sun doesn't reach there. In the summertime, the sun is coming in from the south, and it's going to get pretty hot on that south side if you don't provide shade. Up there on the north side, it'll be cool. So we're thinking about that. Maybe we want to put on the south side spaces where we need heat in the winter and all year long where we want daylight. Then on the north, we might want our less used spaces. So for example, if you're making a bubble diagram, here on the right is a bubble diagram for a house. You might want living room stuff on the south. That's where the room will be warm and well lit. On the east, you might want some place where you could have breakfast and some morning coffee or tea. On the north of the building, it's going to be cold in the winter and not much light getting there relative to the south side. So that's where you could put utility spaces like garages and laundry rooms and so forth. Also, the west side is going to get really hot in the summertime, so you don't want your main living spaces there either. Over here on the left, here is a diagram, a bubble diagram, thinking about what if you were designing a school. Well, if the north side is going to be cool, that might be a good place to put the gym where people are going to get hot running around. If you are thinking about classrooms, you might want your classrooms on the east and on the south where the sunlight will come in, and so forth. So to dial it in a little bit more, looking at this concept diagram in the lower left, you might put something like a living room or a den or a family room on this south side with windows. You might put a kitchen and an attached dining area on the east where you get pleasant morning sun. You might put bedrooms on the north. You're not likely to be there during the daytime, so you're not as worried about sunlight. And you might put stuff that's not a living space, like a laundry room and a garage, on the west, if you didn't put it on the north. The thing to realize is that when you're figuring out where these spaces are going to go, you are also figuring out how much you are going to spend on energy bills throughout the lifetime of the building. And as the USGBC says and Department of Energy says, by the time if you've hired an architect, let's say, by the time you've spent 3% of their design budget, they have already set into place 70% of the energy use for the lifetime of the building. So that early thinking about layout is going to be very important. Here are some diagrams from Charlie Brown at the U of O Energy Lab. And what he's showing us here is that, as the words say up at the top of the screen, the sunlight, because of the angle of the sunlight, in general, the sun will reach into the room about 2.5 times as far as the top of the window is high. So think about that. If you have a long, deep space, the sun is not going to be able to reach to the back of the space. If you have a long space and you want sun to get in there, then you'll want to consider using things like Clerestory Windows. So let's say, for example, your window were 10 feet above the floor. The top of the window is 10 feet above the floor. 2.5 times 10 feet is 25 feet. So if your window is 10 feet above the floor, sunlight will reach about 25 feet into the room. Architects think about heat load calculations and cooling load calculations, and they think about two types of load demand. Skin load dominated buildings are buildings where what we're worried about is heat coming in through the wall or heat escaping through the wall. And we're basically thinking about houses. So these are the ones where it's really important to think about solar orientation and building orientation and windows. Large commercial buildings tend to be internal load dominated. They're big, especially modern buildings. They're big, so passive stuff doesn't work as well, and they have a lot of things in them like people who are hot and computers who generate heat and all that sort of thing. So they are internal load dominated. They are more likely to need cooling year-round. Houses are more likely to need heating. It is interesting to think about precedents from the past. We've looked at ancient human designs like from Mesa Verde and so forth, but it's also interesting just to look back the last 100 to 200 years and see what did designers do before they had electricity, before they had electric lights and air conditioning. What you will notice is that buildings tended to be narrow, so air could pass through for cooling and sunlight could get in for heating and for natural daylighting. They had thermal mass. The walls were made of brick and stone and concrete. The windows could open, that's called operable windows, and they often had shades over the windows, as we see here. So, as we've already seen, USGBC says our windows facing south should be within 15 degrees of true south to be considered passive solar windows. Some designers say that actually if you were within 30 degrees either direction, it would still work. And here's a quote from an architect who likes to write books for people. He says, orientation is 80% of passive solar design. And he is so right. If you go around and look at buildings that are designed for passive solar, like this Blue Ridge Parkway Visitor Center that we looked at last time, you'll often see a sawtooth pattern. You might see a sawtooth pattern sideways, like in this wall, and you might see a sawtooth pattern vertically, maybe for clerestory windows. And especially if it's a multi-storied building, you'll see the upper stories stepped back so that light can get in on all floors. So just be thinking about, if you're building a building, how can you let sunlight get into every space in that building?